It's in the aftermath. Heading the panel is the Honorable Roger Noriega. He is the founder and managing director of Visions America and a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Noriega has more than 2 decades of public policy experience focusing on U.S. interests in the Western Hemisphere. Twice appointed by President George W. Bush, Ambassador Noriega's breadth of experience and contacts offer strategic vision and practical insight on the United States foreign policy and aid programs. Joining him will be Joe Pollack, editor-in-chief and in-house counsel at Breitbart News. He's the author of The Keeshels Affair, Jews and Minority Politics in Post-Apartheid South Africa. He ran for Congress in 2010 in Illinois as a Tea Party Republican. John Solomon serves as president and executive editor of The Washington Guardian. Solomon is one of the country's premier investigative journalists and authors whose award-winning stories over the last quarter century have appeared in Newsweek, The Washington Post, and The New York Times. Last fall, he was one of the first reporters to uncover the truth about the Benghazi massacre. Finally, joining on the panel is the Honorable Ernest Istook, is a distinguished fellow at the Heritage Foundation and hosts a blather-free daily talk radio show. Prior to Heritage, he served 14 years as a United States Congressman from Oklahoma and was rated as one of the top 20 conservatives in the House of Representatives. Please welcome your next panel.
Good afternoon, everybody. How many people would love the opportunity to follow Senator Rand Paul? Well, we hope we can make it interesting just the same, because our panel discussion is intended to talk about Benghazi. Now, it's interesting to me. When Bill Clinton was president of the United States, there were so many people who made excuses and saying, well, of course the president was lying. After all, it was only about sex, and everybody lies about that. And how many times have you had anything that involved federal spending or campaign finance, and you can't get a straight answer? For example, what is the minimum cost to be in the Organizing for America meetings with President Obama? Is there a discount available from that $500,000? So we're told that politicians are expected not to be truthful when it comes to money. However, I believe why Benghazi has struck a resonant chord with people all across the country is because in this case, the concern is that the president and his people were lying about matters of life and death. And that is in such a different category from anything else. And the shame of Benghazi is not only the president, but it's with the media itself and what they did and they failed to do to follow up with it. Our panel is meant to explore, well, I don't think that we're able to give you a formal report of what happened. And if you've read through the findings of this State Department report, you find that it leaves just as many questions unanswered as answered. And we still don't know how many people were injured. Are they still at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C.? Have they been released? We can't get a straight answer about that. Now, if you had been one of the 12 U.S. senators who had a chance to dine with President Obama this past week, what might have been one of your questions to him? What happened that night? It has been 6 months, and we still have mysteries. And we're told, well, the FBI is investigating things. If you look at the orders that were given to the FBI about what they're supposed to be investigating, it's curious to me, because the State Department investigated what went on in the State Department, and the FBI was tasked to tell us what went on overseas, but nobody has been asked to investigate what went on at the White House that night. It's a glaring omission. Who wants to know? Do you want to know? Why do you want to know? What difference does it make? And when we get answers like that, nothing you ask has any importance. What difference does it make? Or the president, his answer this week, saying, well, I don't want to balance the budget just for the sake of it. I don't want to have to tell the truth to the American people just for the sake of being open and honest. He has higher purposes to serve. And Benghazi, I suppose, stands for the fact that the higher purpose was to make sure that you had a good rest so you could go to Vegas the next day and raise funds there. So Benghazi is about the shame of the media in failing to answer these questions, not even noticing that the things that the president commissioned as investigations omitted the White House itself. Neither the State Department nor the FBI was tasked with that. If and when the FBI finishes their work, maybe somebody will notice they didn't do anything about what happened at the White House or failed to happen at the White House. But by then, the whole philosophy of the Obama administration is that it's going to be too late. So now is the opportunity that we are going to be hearing from our panelists. And each of us will present a little bit of a different perspective on the panel about what happened that night. And then I'll have some Q&A interaction with them. And we'll see if even if we cannot answer the questions for you, perhaps we can help people to understand what are the right questions so that someday, whether it be a presidential candidate or a CNN moderator or senators having dinner with the president, maybe somebody can come up with the right questions to ask about Benghazi, and then hope and pray that someday we will get the proper answers. Let me turn the time over to our panelists to make their remarks. Roger?
Thank you very much, Congressman. Please hold your applause. Thank you very much. I have somebody paying attention up front. Let me begin by making a very stark appraisal of what we learned from Benghazi, and just ask you to remember the famous commercials during the 2008 campaign about the 3 a.m. phone call. Well, the primary lesson from Benghazi is, ladies and gentlemen, that 3 a.m. phone call went to voicemail. And it is a manifestation of the fact that we have a president who takes responsibility for only one thing, as far as I can tell, which is improving his golf score. And he does that because it's something that only he can do, right? Well, when you're president of the United States, there are a lot of things that only you can do. Benghazi is actually two separate scandals, staggering scandals. One is the events of that terrible night and the significance of those and how it was handled, and the other is the cover-up. And the folks in this room probably understand much better than most Americans because they pay attention and are critical about the things that our government does, no matter who's in office. But let's just sort of review those things and take a quick look at them, because I have about 5 minutes here. There was the actual attack and the response, which showed gross mismanagement, a colossal blunders along the way when that embassy was attacked on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. Now, I had experience as Assistant Secretary of State when our embassy in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, was the third most dangerous post after Baghdad and Kabul. And we had problems with security. We were worried about American citizens being attacked by that. And the ambassador was responding, asking for security precautions to be taken, and we took them. And let me just tell you something that's sort of interesting. I worked for two secretaries of state in that period, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, and both of them independently, spontaneously asked me about security at the embassy in Port-au-Prince. And thank God I had a good answer. And we did our jobs, and we were secure. If something had happened, I can assure you that the last thing I would have told either one of those bosses is, what difference does it make? Because in point of fact, if I had said that, that would have been the last thing I said in that job. Why weren't we ready for Benghazi? Well, because there was the misinformation that the president said that al-Qaeda was on the run. Instead, they were coming over the wall, not on the run. Benghazi was bloody evidence of a resurgent al-Qaeda murdering a U.S. ambassador and literally raising its flag over U.S. territory, not only in Benghazi but other capitals. Then the worst of all of that night. Dozens of Americans left to fend for themselves for 4 to 7 hours without any help coming. Secretary Panetta testified very, very late, many months after this process, and said, you know, we can't have the American military in harm's way. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there are Americans facing harm at the hands of a terrorist attack, in harm's way is exactly what the American military needs to be and where it wants to be. Quite frankly, it is shameless that some irresponsible, anonymous person gave an order to stand down rather than stage a rescue and doesn't have the guts to come forward and take responsibility for that fateful decision. The second part of this whole scandal is the cover-up itself. We know this. Even before they first blamed that infamous video for this incident in Benghazi, they knew that was not true. But they served up that cover story repeatedly, shamelessly, and in the case of our president, indignantly for months thereafter. Maybe it was because they were totally uninformed about what was going on. Let me emphasize another sobering lesson from Benghazi, and you all know this. American journalism, as we knew it before our rock star president, American journalism is dead. Rather than raise the questions, the tough questions the Congressman was mentioning, they have behaved like hockey goalies in front of Barack Obama's net, fending off those questions. If we have a government that lies to its people with impunity, it makes a very big difference in a very dangerous world. And because U.S. credibility is sometimes the only thing that stands between where we are and mayhem, chaos, and grave security threats. And what does that world look like today? Very, very briefly. The best thing you can say about the Middle East peace process is that there is less peace and no process. The president will be visiting Israel for the first time while he's been in office, arriving with no ideas for jumpstarting that process, and that is the least of our problems. And quite frankly, if he had ideas, they would probably be bad ones. Iran is creeping toward a nuclear bomb. The new sanctions are biting a bit, but they were adopted too late by the Congress over objections of the administration. And al-Qaeda is resurgent and spreading throughout Middle East and North Africa. Iran and Afghanistan, where the American people have spent so much blood and treasure, are struggling to stand on their own, because that's precisely where we're leaving them, on their own. The radical Muslim Brotherhood is at the helm in Egypt. A slaughter is going on in Syria, with 60,000 dead and hundreds of thousands of refugees destabilizing a dangerous region. And what is our message to terrorists whom we do capture? 7 deadly words: you have the right to remain silent. Now more than ever, we need a president who is engaged and who will make tough decisions and stand behind them. Is there anyone who looks at Benghazi and thinks that we have such a president today? Thank you.
Good afternoon, CPAC. It's a privilege to be with you here today and to be on this panel and to follow Senator Rand Paul. And in the spirit of debate, I want to begin my remarks on Benghazi with a small criticism of Senator Paul's stance on foreign policy. Not a McCain-Graham criticism, but a constructive one, I hope. I love the guy, and his filibuster was brilliant, long overdue. But while he was right on the Constitution, he was wrong on the law of war, especially the distinction between a combatant and a non-combatant. Conservatives cannot follow his definition as it now stands, he may change it, or we will not deserve to be taken seriously on foreign policy. Let's start in Benghazi. The attack on the U.S. consulate in September was the worst national security failure since the original 9/11. It truly deserves the label scandal for 3 reasons. One, because President Barack Obama and his administration lied about the attack. Two, because the media aided the cover-up. And three, because the president did nothing to rescue those at the consulate, including Ambassador Chris Stevens. But Benghazi was not just a national security failure. It was also a constitutional failure. The president has a constitutional duty to act as commander-in-chief, and he failed to do so. He did not, as he once claimed in a TV interview with a reporter in Denver, one of the few reporters who got past the hockey goalie. He did not issue those 3 directives, as he claimed, when he knew what was going on in Benghazi, nor did he communicate with his cabinet throughout the evening after learning of the attacks. And we now know that the cabinet members did not talk to each other either. President Obama's dereliction of duty, because that's what it was, in Benghazi, reinforced a global perception of growing American weakness. Al-Qaeda has lost its leader, but it has regained its momentum. We have done little to challenge Chinese ambitions in the Western Pacific. We have capitulated to Russian demands on missile defense in Eastern Europe. And most of all, we have failed to prevent Iran from advancing towards obtaining nuclear weapons. In speeches, of course, the Obama administration continues to insist that all options are on the table, including a military option. But Iran considers our actions, not President Obama's words. And what Iran sees is a president committed to retreat. In June 2009, Iran was surrounded, east and west, by US-led troops, over 60,000 in Afghanistan and over 130,000 in Iraq. That likely encouraged Iranians to rise up against their government after the stolen elections that summer. We could have helped the Green Revolution. We could have declared the government of Iran illegitimate. It didn't need to be a military response. We could have done something diplomatic, which President Obama and his new Secretary of Defense are very fond of, but we didn't. Had we intervened in that small way, we could have helped the Iranians overturn their government and its nuclear program and its support for terrorism worldwide without firing a shot. But we allowed the regime time to regroup. And 5 years later, by 2014, by next year, Iran will face no US-led troops in Iraq, 12,000 at most in Afghanistan, and 1 less US Navy carrier in the Persian Gulf. Now that looks like retreat from their perspective. Iran remains the key strategic challenge in the region today. It has formed alliances with diverse terror groups, including Al-Qaeda and related groups. It has connections now with Muslim Brotherhood governments. It bridges the Sunni-Shia divide to fight common enemies, the US and Israel. Yet the regime remains weak, and this is key, because it is hated by its own people. We can remove Iran as a threat if we commit to a policy of regime change, by peaceful transition, if possible, and by military removal, if necessary. Regime change is rarely the right policy, rarely, but it is the right policy in Iran. And the irony is that Iran is one of the few places in the Middle East where the Obama administration refused to support a popular uprising. But the regime can be toppled and must be before Iran harms our allies in the region or attacks the US homeland in some way. We suspect, and Iran believes, that President Obama lacks the will to confront Iran, much less change it. But do we conservatives ourselves have the will to do so? That question has become even more acute, I would argue, since Senator Paul's filibuster last week. The filibuster was a brave and heroic gesture of opposition. It proved that at least one leader, a Tea Party leader, was prepared to stand up for the Constitution and for the principle that individual liberty precedes government power. But Senator Paul was wrong about one thing. It is not as easy to distinguish between combatants and non-combatants as he suggested. A foreign terrorist on foreign soil does not stop being a terrorist simply because he or she is far from the battlefield. If we accept the hypothetical example that he used, that a terrorist at a cafe is never a legitimate target, then we cannot protect ourselves from terror. In our zeal to roll back government power, we will have placed our liberty in danger. Similarly, in embracing the sequester, we cannot accept defense cuts that may prove more costly over time by putting our security at risk. We must replace those cuts with other cuts. We cannot be serious about protecting individual liberty from government if we are not also serious about protecting liberty from all enemies, foreign and domestic. The reason we have our Constitution and not the Articles of Confederation is our former system of government could not protect the nation or pay its debt. As we confront today's debt, which is a national security risk, we must not make defense, which is the first priority of government, the first target for cuts. The Benghazi attack happened because the president sacrificed military readiness for ideology and domestic politics. We must learn from that mistake. Our Constitution calls for limited government. It also calls for a government that can defend the nation. And as we pare back the expansive government that came along with the war on terror after 9/11, we must see that war through to victory and ensure that our military is ready for the next challenges. Alexis de Tocqueville warned us, quote, "No protracted war can fail to endanger the freedom of a democratic country." And that's the point Senator Paul is making. War may lead to centralized power and the destruction of liberty over time. But Tocqueville also warned, quote, "When a democratic people engages in war after a long peace, it incurs much more risk of defeat than any other nation." Benghazi reminds us we cannot defend liberty if we do not take the fight to our enemies. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here. I've been an investigative journalist my whole life for 25 years, which doesn't make you very popular in a family of Irish cops, but it does help give you an opportunity to take a lens at the things that go on in Washington and elsewhere in the country, and to challenge power, and to try to get the truth out to American public that yearns for it in a government that often doesn't want to provide it. But in the course of this career, I have never been at a point in time where I've seen a weaker media. And I think the congressman said it just right, that Benghazi, of course, is a failure of diplomacy, of security, of truthfulness, but it's also a failure of the American media. We do not today ask enough of the hard questions. And why is that? What has happened to us that has made us basically a bad equivalent of the Silence of the Lambs? We are shrunken. The economy has taken a lot from news media. There's been this great exodus of brain trust. Reporters who used to have 30 and 40 years of experience in military and intelligence matters, which really matters when you're trying to cover complex issues like Benghazi, they've walked out the door. They've also created a culture in many of the media companies today that the news of the moment is so important, we must tweet it, we must run out and get the top line, that no one dare bite the hand that feed them. And therefore, so much of the media today has become beholden to the people who hand out the daily news. And if you are afraid to buck that trend, you're never going to get to the bottom of the stories like Benghazi. And this really, really deeply troubles me. The other day, I was writing a story that was not going to be too favorable to the Justice Department, and I was talking to one of the chief spokespersons there, and I told him what I had, that there was evidence that the FBI director and the Attorney General had used a corporate Learjet that had been bought for the war on terror, and were using it instead for their own personal travel. And you can imagine the first few words out of the spokesperson's mouth. I won't utter them here because it wouldn't be appropriate for a family audience. But through the course of a 10-minute conversation, the spokesperson actually used these words: "If you go with that, I will destroy you. I will turn your colleagues against you. I will make sure you're embarrassed." Now, obviously it didn't work because I'm here today, but more importantly, it's an idle threat. We live in a free society, and when we stop as reporters exercising the First Amendment, which means asking tough questions, which means going against the grain, then we've already ruined what our founding fathers intended for my profession. I just want to share for a couple minutes what we've done. Last summer, I was really concerned about this trend, And so I made two decisions. One was to go back home to one of my favorite places. I used to be the executive editor of the Washington Times, and I went back home to the Times to be its chief digital officer and to try to help build new business models that would strengthen one of the great newspapers in the nation's capital. And then I decided to take some of my own personal money, and a couple of colleagues of mine, two great AP colleagues I grew up with, we put our money together and we started our own website called the Washington Guardian. And we're not interested in the top line of the news. We're interested in getting to the stories that other people aren't telling. And we were started over Labor Day weekend, and long and behold, just 10 or 11 days later, became the beginning of Benghazi. And I was about to go on a plane overseas for a trip, and I saw these reports. And I quickly looked and said, I wonder where diplomatic security is. We did a quick story saying that for the last 5 years, the State Department hadn't been meeting its security requirements for embassies around the country. I thought I'd contribute to the dialogue. I jumped on the plane. When I got to Europe, I opened up the New York Times, the Washington Post, and several other media outlets, and their story was the State Department says it did everything it could to fortify embassies. Well, no, not really. Just read the documents. That wasn't true. By that time, the storyline had emerged that this was a spontaneous attack from a crowd that had gotten angry about an Islamic video. And I sat there and said, who brings mortars and RPGs to a video protest? It's just not possible. And within 40 hours of the attack, the Washington Guardian had a story that said, no, it was al-Qaeda-linked extremists in some form of planning that were there to carry out the attack, and it came in two waves, and it had absolutely nothing to do with the video that had been making its way on the internet. So what did the rest of the media report the next 2 days? Well, no, it was the video. The UN ambassador went on television on Sunday and said, no, it was a video, and came up with this sort of muted story. Yet sitting in plain open view were people in the military and intelligence community who were saying, no, that is not true. The media took that storyline for 2 or 3 weeks until it could no longer be sustained. And then we started to get the shards of some of the truth. But for each story we wrote at The Guardian, there was almost an opposite reaction in the news media. And that deeply troubles me today. If you think about the most recent storyline that we have, which is that somehow the administration knew the truth when Susan Rice went on TV, but a bunch of intelligence officers, probably people I talked to get the truth early on, somehow edited out all the storyline and no one figured out that it was going to be misleading on TV. That's the official storyline of the administration, and the news media has sat there and done that. So a few weeks ago, we decided, well, what did the president know? We want to go find out, and we were able to get a copy or a briefing of what was in the president's daily briefing 2 days after Benghazi. And what did it say? The president was told 2 days after Benghazi and 3 days before Susan Rice went on television that, in fact, it was al-Qaeda related, unrelated to the video, in a semi-organized attack carried out by extremists. How can it be that the media does not pick up those lines and tell the American people the truth as we have come to expect it? What can you do to change this? I guess that's the next question. You're all sitting here, and I'm sure you're not big fans of the media to start with, but there are some bright spots. And if I could disagree with the ambassador just a little bit, we're probably on life support, but we're not totally dead in the journalism world yet. There are bright spots. You know, Breitbart and other new places have come up. New media places are cropping up. The Washington Guardian are coming back. And those places give us the best opportunity in the immediate future to get the truth back out and to ask the hard questions that used to be asked by Sam Donaldson in the White House press room in the Reagan days. You all remember those famous tussles. We need people with the courage, regardless. They're not worried about the next moment's scoop, what we're going to tweet in 5 minutes, what we're going to go on TV and pontificate about, but what the truth really needs to be. And so we're seeing some of those crop up. If you see those places, get behind them, support them. If you have children that are thinking journalism is the last place in the world to go, encourage them that it could actually be an honorable profession, that there is good things to be done. And you have a place where you put your money. If you're reading and subscribing to publications today that do not give you the truth, and you just know when you read it you didn't get a full story, you have a way to vote, and it's with your pocketbook, where you advertise, where you subscribe. There's an opportunity for folks at this convention here and all across the country to begin to send a message to my profession that it's time to clean up our act. It's time to reinvest in expertise, and it's time to get the American people the truth. And if you help us do that, I promise you next year at CPAC we'll have a slightly better story to tell, and hopefully not another Benghazi. So thank you for your time. I look forward to the Q&A.
Good. I want to give our panelists an opportunity to discuss some important aspects and elaborate on some things. And I want you to listen closely to this quotation I'm about to read you from President Obama. It's from his speech given in Cairo, June 4th of 2009. And I want the panelists to address, is Benghazi a symptom of a president who is soft on militant Islam? This is the statement that the president gave in Cairo. Quote, "I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear." I'm going to read that quote once more. "I consider it part of my responsibility as President of the United States to fight against negative stereotypes of Islam wherever they appear." Did that play into what we saw with the tragedy in Benghazi? Gentlemen? John?
I'll start just because in the early days, I knew what the administration was telling me as I was trying to report those early stories. And there was two storylines that still resonate in my brain. And that is, one, we need to be sensitive to the Libyan government. It's always the right of the local government to investigate a crime like this. And I kept thinking this wasn't a crime, it's an attack, it's a war, an act of war when you attack our embassy. That sort of sensitivity has dominated a lot of the discussion about Benghazi and earlier things that have happened in this administration. And again, going back to my own profession, why don't we ask the question, where is the American interest in letting Libyans take the lead on the investigation? Why hasn't our FBI gotten to the people we've asked for? Why wasn't our military called immediately? I could have flown from Washington, D.C., Dulles, and got to Benghazi quicker than the boots got on the ground that day. How can that be in America when Lebanon was struck or when Iraq acted up in the Clinton years? We had jets rode up and going in just a few minutes, 20 hours, 2 attacks before we got there. I think the sensitivity of lending too much credence to the region, beginning with the Arab Spring, being more concerned about that is a dominant theme in everything I talk about. Is it right or wrong? That's for the American people to decide. They get to vote. But as a journalist, I hear this theme every day.
Joel?
It's not objectionable for the president to defend Muslims because there are millions of Muslims who are American citizens. But that's not what he said. He said Islam as a religion or a civilization or what have you. And the connection to Benghazi is tied to the story that was told and reiterated in the media about the video, where the president actually went to the United Nations and gave a speech after Benghazi talking about those who defame Islam. And I forget his exact remarks, but basically saying he was going after those who defame Islam. Well, that's not why we elected him. That's not his role. And I think the movie story is interesting because what the president was doing was actually not very subtle. What the president was doing and the White House and everybody who bought into this idea there was this movie that caused all the trouble, who made the movie? It was someone in America. We didn't know the identity of the filmmaker at the time, but it was a Christian filmmaker. This was a rehash of the Quran burning controversy of a few years before, where a pastor was going to burn the Quran, and our generals and our politicians felt they had to apologize to the rest of the world for this insensitive exercise of the First Amendment of the Constitution. And I'm not saying it's a great idea, but the First Amendment doesn't exist to protect speech that you like. So they reiterated this. What the president was saying to the Muslim world in Benghazi was, don't blame my administration, blame these crazy, bitter clingers in America who do these things that offend the rest of the world. What he was basically saying is the people in this room are the problem. The people who defend their faith, the people who defend their liberties, and who don't give a damn about the rest of the world, they're the problem. Absolve me and love America. You don't have to accept American ideals, and you don't have to accept the American people. And I think it was a rehash of a narrative that the administration was a part of in that Quran burning case, that the media, the mainstream media reiterated, and that Hollywood has reinforced. There's a cultural battle that the administration is waging against people in this room, against the bitter clingers who like the Second Amendment, who use the First Amendment, whether it's religion or speech, and that to me was the disgrace. Remember, before we knew that there had been deaths in Benghazi, we knew that there were people scaling the walls of the embassy in Cairo, and the U.S. Embassy in Cairo Twitter feed was tweeting apologies for this film and talking about how we shouldn't be insensitive to the religious feelings of others. Their first response was to dump on the First Amendment, and not just the First Amendment in general, but those who use it to express the ideas expressed in this room and at this conference. And I think that was the disgrace that really set the stage for everything else that followed.
Okay. But before Roger, let me just give you the quote from the United Nations speech to which Joel Pollack referred. And President Obama said this: "The future must not belong to those who slander the Prophet of Islam. But to be credible, those who condemn that slander must also condemn the hate we see in the images of Jesus Christ that are desecrated, or churches that are destroyed, or the Holocaust that is denied." And I will just note that the effort to provide balance, as it were, in that was totally missing in the speech that he made in Cairo. Roger?
Well, yes, I would say that the single biggest event in sort of modern history that has hurt the image of Islam were the 9/11 attacks. And if you're going to prevent those sorts of attacks in the future against us and other innocent people around the world, we have to do a more effective job of fighting terrorism than I think he's prepared to do. This sniper and drone foreign policy that snuffs out terrorists rather than capturing them on those occasions when you can, and taking them to Guantanamo, not to Manhattan, questioning them, precisely not telling them that they have the right to remain silent, is a better approach and better tactics in this war. And I think we all could pay very dearly for this ideological orientation that they have against Guantanamo, against the tactics that were used that kept us safe for a dozen years. And part of that ideology, frankly, is in the president's mind, the kind of orientation he had as a young man and growing up and growing into adulthood is this sort of third world, anti-colonial, anti-Western orientation. And I think that's at the heart of a lot of this. And that those attitudes that he has make this a less safe world, quite frankly.
Okay. One of the key moments, maybe even a turning point in the presidential race last fall, was in the second presidential debate where Mitt Romney asked the president he said, "Oh, you hadn't called this an act of terrorism." Obama said he did. Candy Crowley interjected herself. You remember that moment. I believe that Mitt Romney asked totally the wrong question. I want to read you from the transcript the question that was posed by a member of the audience named Carrie Ladka, which was never answered by Obama. And I believe Romney should have used his time to say, "Mr. President, why don't you answer the question from the audience? And I'll give you some of my time to do so." This was the question from Carrie Ladka. And he said, "This question actually comes from a brain trust of my friends at Global Telecom Supply in Mineola yesterday." Anybody here from Mineola? Nearby, near Mineola, in East Texas. Okay. And it just shows some of the wisdom of everyday people as opposed to political people. We were sitting around talking about Libya, and we were reading and became aware of reports that the State Department refused extra security for our embassy in Benghazi, Libya, prior to the attacks that killed 4 Americans. And here was his question: who was it that denied enhanced security and why? Now, I'd like your comments about what was the right question that should have been asked, and how would you have made sure that President Obama answered it while on that national stage at a critical moment when the deaths were still fresh? Let's go in reverse order this time if we can.
Well, when I said that American journalism was dead, of course there are exceptions, and a lot of it is the new media, and of course Fox News, and there is one brave soul, it's CBS News, who's done some reporting on this that probably keeps her resume handy.
Cheryl Atkinson. Let's hear it.
Exactly.
Let's hear it for Cheryl Atkinson and her reporting on CBS.
But again, from my experience in the State Department, where we were making those decisions on a regular basis about the security of our embassies. First off, I have had the title. It's a great honor to have the title of ambassador. If you're out in far corners of the world and you're under attack, if your first concern is the people that work with you, and the very idea that nobody came within, and they made no effort to muster any sort of rescue attempt at all, is, I think, scandalous. And the very idea that the people who were responsible for security and making decisions about security, these people should be fired. And I agree 100%. I don't remember which senator it was who said it to Hillary Clinton when she,
Senator Johnson, who
Senator
was supposed
Johnson,
to be on the panel,
who said you
could not make it.
you should have lost your job. I would have fired you. And that's certainly where I would have been.
Well,
no one
Rand
took
Paul.
responsibility for that. I mean, up and down the line, if that sort of attack had happened in our administration, those people would have paid with their jobs, and rightfully so. And the media would have insisted there be some sort of accountability, and that's precisely the problem. A scandal like this happens, and I'm not talking about show trials, but I'm talking about the Congress asking effective questions in a timely way, people making themselves available and forced to make themselves available to answer these questions, and then some sort of accountability for those lives lost. And I think it's just tragic that the father of one of the slain men was standing there receiving the casket, and next to him was Hillary Clinton, and she leans over and says, "We're going to get the guy who made that video." What an utter scandal, when she knew in her mind it had nothing to do with that video, building a narrative, human being to human being, propagating this politically motivated lie is really outrageous to me.
Okay.
I think going back to the second debate, the question that Romney allowed himself to get tracked into was the question of what did the president call this attack, and did he call it a terror attack? And that's when Candy Crowley intervened. Now that was a somewhat important question because it went to the question of whether Obama had lied to the American people. But it really was a secondary question, and the danger when you let the media define the questions and you let the media host the debates is you let them suck you into these things, and it's always a game of keep away. Because Cheryl Atkinson did a great job at CBS, but Steve Kroft, CBS 60 Minutes, was sitting on the videotape where Obama said it wasn't an act of terrorism and didn't release it until 2 days before everybody went to vote. And they had that tape, they never released it until then, so they could say, well, we did release it before the election. It happened to be 3 weeks late, but the real question is, what were you doing when Americans were in danger? And Obama, by that time, had made a very specific, testable claim, a claim that could be questioned. And this is the point about journalists not knowing what questions to ask and not having that experience or even interest, actually. Obama said specifically, I gave 3 directives as soon as I heard about what was going on in Benghazi. One of them was to make sure our personnel were safe. The second one was to start an investigation as to how it happened, and the third was to make sure it never happens again. Well, that's very nice. It's all after the fact because none of that addresses the ongoing crisis unless you can argue that making our personnel safe does. But when did he make those directives? Is there any evidence of those directives? Those are public documents, presumably, if they were memoranda or if they were executive orders or whatever they were. They can be obtained somewhere. Evidence of those directives must exist. Where are the journalists asking Jay Carney every day, we'll sit here day after day until you give us those directives? Where are the directives the president said he issued? When were they issued? And there's no answer to that because they were probably never issued. I think it was a huge lie. And why do we know it's a lie? Because subsequent testimony has revealed the president called no one, spoke to no one, contacted no one, convened no meetings. The only thing we actually learned that happened, in a sense, in those hearings in January and February, which we finally got, the only criticism we heard was from General Dempsey criticizing Hillary Clinton, saying, I can't imagine she wouldn't have known about the security request that was denied, about the cables that came through. But other than that, no one else has really asked questions about what was done. And that's what the media have to do. It's so easy, and they're not doing it.
Okay. Yeah, spot on. It's hard for me to handicap what question would have worked that night because, in fact, the matter is in October we didn't have nearly a complete story that we have now, and I don't believe we have a complete story now. But I know what question, if I could come back in a second life and be a White House correspondent instead of investigative reporter, I know what question I'd ask every day when Jay Carney walked in. The President of the United States promised the American people that he would bring to justice the people who committed this attack. It is now 7 months and 12 days or whatever the day is each day. When is he going to do that? How is he going to do that? That question never gets asked in the White House briefing room. It never gets asked in an interview with the president. What about the families who are sitting back there when 9/11 occurred? Justice began less than a month. You can go back to Lebanon. You can go back to the times when Saddam Hussein violated the no-fly zone. Things happened quickly, 6, 7 months, and we're still waiting on the Libyans to give us things, I guess, is the explanation I get as a reporter. It doesn't seem as though that's a satisfied answer. If I had a second, if they hadn't thrown me out of the White House briefing room after the first question, I'd probably ask this question, Mr. President, when you were sitting there and Susan Rice went on television and gave that storyline and you sat with your presidential daily brief and you knew what the real story was, did you feel compelled at all to correct the public record? No one's ever asked him that record. He clearly had to know that that story was not right. I know because his presidential daily briefing told him so. Why did he not feel obligated for weeks and months afterward to try to correct the storyline and then to blame it on a bunch of intelligence censors who, by the way, told me the truth 40 hours after it happened? Those are two questions, if I ever get a chance to go in the White House briefing room, I'd ask.
Okay. Gentlemen, I want to give you a chance to, based upon each of you have done a lot of work into digging into the rumors, the facts, the deceit, the unanswered questions about Benghazi. I want to give you each a chance to speculate, if you will, and you can tell us the degree to which it's pure speculation, informed guesses, or you really believe this is what happened. But I want to ask you, what do you believe is the dirty little secret of Benghazi? And secondly, what do you think President Obama did that night that was so pressing? Was his favorite movie on TV, or what was it that he totally avoided making any calls, giving any instructions, or whatever? So let's hear your informed guesses, speculations.
I can be very quick on this. I mean, the dirty little secret.
Come on, have some fun here.
Dirty little secret is hardly a secret. It's that the president talked about this once and walked away and forgot about it. What he was doing, I know that the president's, every minute of the president's time is blocked out, is tracked very, very closely. What he wasn't doing is talking, we know this, to talking any member of his national security team. When he knew and went to bed that night knowing that the man, remember when he care about their well-being? Well, you have to care more than going out to Dover Air Force Base and receiving their bodies when you leave them there defenseless, or Andrews, I guess. So, I mean, that's the fact that the president did not do his duty as commander-in-chief.
Okay. Joel Pollack.
I think the dirty secret is that the administration understood that there were Americans at risk and decided that they could contain the risk if they did not send further troops in, because there's always a risk when you send troops to protect fellow troops or civilians in danger, diplomats, that there will be more casualties. And I think what President Obama and his advisors were worried about was that there would be many, many casualties. It's happened before many times in Afghanistan. You know, we lost Navy SEALs on rescue missions when helicopters full of Navy SEALs were shot down. We've lost lots of civilian police officers, firefighters, similar circumstances. They want to be in harm's way. They want to be there. That's what they're trained to do and want to do. But there's always a risk you're going to lose more lives, and I think the president was worried that having many casualties would really be something he couldn't ignore politically. But if you could contain the casualties to the few who were there would not be political damage. Now that sounds like an awfully cruel thing to say about the President of the United States. You don't have to believe me. You can read Foreign Policy on the web or in print, which had an article recently about how the president failed in Afghanistan, and the argument made, based on journalism reporting, was that every decision made by President Obama about Afghanistan was mediated through his political advisors. Everything that was done was in response to the question, what will Republicans do about this? What will the media say about that? What are the domestic political consequences? He did not act as commander-in-chief that night. He acted as head of his political party, head of his campaign. And I think the dirty little secret is they decided to cut their losses, as they may have seen it, and to contain the violence, to have people on standby, ready to go, but not to sacrifice further U.S. personnel, further assets, in case there was more firepower on the ground than they knew about, and they stood down for that reason. I think that's the secret.
John?
All right. Well, I'm going to confess I'm going to be boring on this question because by professional training, I never speculate about something I'm not sure of, at least not in public. But I do think there's a couple things I can offer insight on that might be interesting to you. The media has covered Benghazi as though it was one continuous attack, but in fact it was two waves of attack 4 hours apart. The first attack occurred on the consulate itself. It was quick, people died quickly. There's probably no opportunity at that moment that military assets could have gotten there in time, short of launching cruise missiles, which you wouldn't do, to take care of that first attack. But then 4 hours passed, and then a much more sophisticated attack with mortars and RPGs that were really destructive in just 11 minutes. And that's the place where the two brave Navy SEALs who were wrongly blamed in the media as being the security guys who lost their ambassador, they weren't his security detail at all. Could the United States have gotten assets into the country between those two attacks? Could the United States have the capability in 4 hours to get boots on the ground? And if we don't have that capability, what are we doing in Libya without a positioning to have that sort of rescue capability? We need to get to the bottom of that answer. We know from General Ham that no one ever asked for any assets to go. But could we have, and where were they, and could they have made it there? That's a very important question for future protection of our assets around the globe. I think the second question that comes to mind a lot to me is why was Chris Stevens there on September 11th? And this is the question. I get radio silence. No one wants to answer this question. It makes no sense for an ambassador to be sitting in a location where they were just denied additional security. And remember, I got his very last memo to Hillary Clinton 11 hours before he died, and he described Benghazi as an absolute chaotic zoo of violence. People getting blown up. Here, I'm worried that the local militia won't be able to support us anymore. They're threatening to pull our security. Someone has to answer why Chris Stevens was here, because it didn't make sense. It was a symbolic day for terrorists, September 11th. It was in the most insecure of locations we knew at the time. And you, Mr. Ambassador, you know this. You don't go in without a good reason. So someone has to answer the question, why did he go there? And I don't think the administration, certainly in all the times I've asked it, wants to answer that question. I don't know why, but I'm going to keep digging.
Okay. Final question, and gentlemen, it's important to keep answers very brief on this, but the fact that this attack occurred at a time when the president said, well, Osama bin Laden is dead, and we've got al-Qaeda on the run, and wanted it to appear that militant Islam was impotent, and yet we've seen from that attack, we saw the Algeria attack at the BP facility, Libya, Mali, Algeria, al-Qaeda affiliates in North Africa. What is this telling us about the level of multinational cooperation and sophistication of terrorism and how it remains a threat? You got to be brief, but please tell us.
Al-Qaeda's on the run, so we've put them into many different countries. They used to be in one place where we could bomb them in Afghanistan. They're in Syria, Mali, Algeria, God knows where else in Latin America. Everyone I talk to tells me that Al-Qaeda is still resurgent, but smaller and more surgical in its approach, and I don't think the media has done a very good job at highlighting that threat.
All righty.
I think that one of the reasons that terror groups survive is they get sponsorship or tolerance from states. They don't simply exist in a vacuum. There are states that fund, arm, train, cover for them. Iran is one of those states. Syria, which is dependent on Iran, is one of those states. And there are others as well. States, it doesn't always, again, have to be militarily. There are diplomatic ways to deal with certain states. But we've got to stop the people who are accountable to the international community directly, who are accountable because we give them foreign aid, as we're doing now in Egypt, for example. We've got to stop them from promoting the acts of terrorism and the ideology of terrorism that is fueling the resurgence of Al-Qaeda and other groups across the region.
Well, what we learned was that in spite of the fact that the president made the gutsiest decision ever in the history of mankind to kill Osama bin Laden, and it made 2 very good movies about it, Al-Qaeda is still a very pressing threat, and we have to remember Hezbollah as well. I'm a Latin Americanist, and I'll just mention very, very briefly that Hezbollah has a beachhead in Venezuela. It's elsewhere. They partner with the narco-traffickers, and that means that threat washes right up to our border. And I have to give credit to people like Michael McCall and Jeff Duncan, who are focusing on, in the U.S. Congress, who are focusing on this threat, because that's the one that we're going to face next. And God forbid John Kerry is before the Senate one of these days and has the opportunity to say, what difference does it make?
All right. Thank you. Roger Noriega, Joel Pollack, John Solomon, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for spending time with us.
Driving down the street today, I saw a sign for